dad was just ecstatic. It's beautiful to see him that ecstatic. You know, when you're, I was just upstairs with a group of students here in Baltimore City Public Schools, and asking like advice for how you made it through. And I really had no advice of great substance, because I think the first thing I had was I had two parents, and then after that I got really lucky. But the functional part is that two parents. And so, being here in Baltimore tonight for my second book, and having my dad, introduce me is a privilege. Hi, y'all. Hey. Is a privilege beyond anything that I could expect it. I don't know if Dad remembers this, but the last book that came out, I think we did our first event at Human Books in Harlem. You remember this? And Dad introduced me there too. And I think the entire population of folks there, it was about this row right here. That was it. That was it. I should have came to Baltimore. That was my mistake. I was in New York. I forgot where I was from. But that's okay. That's all right. You work at it, you hone your stuff, and you hope to get to a point where you can do something a little bit more. And so the foundation of that is first of all, my parents, my father, Paul Coates, who introduced me, my mother, Shaw Waters, who is here. Thank you very much for being here. This is take a bow. This is not a small thing. I talk about it in the book. My dad was a great lover of books as a young person, but it was really my mom who taught me to read and write. And I don't know how aware my mom was of it at the time. Maybe she was totally aware. I don't want to take any credit away from anyone. But certainly I proceed from there, very much so. And so like my first lessons in writing, I had many teachers over the year, but my mom was actually my first editor. And I was like, how old was I when I was writing? I was at 5, 6 years old. The essays, remember the essays used to make me write? How old? 5, 6, something like that, very young. Oh, so maybe 6, 7, yeah. But young, and that really, it all really proceeds from there. Having said that, creating this book, Between the World and Me, required another editor who is here with me tonight, my great friend Chris Jackson. Where are you, Chris? I don't know where Chris is. Is Chris not in here? Or am I totally, raise your hand. He's in the back. Are you in the back? Jesus. Oh, okay, all right. Yeah, so wow. Sorry about that, man. That's a metaphor in that right there, right? They got you in the back there. But I'm just going, and I'm going to do this, I think everywhere I go to talk about this book. Chris is really, I said this the other day in an interview, Chris is really the hero of this book. Because what I came to him was with a very, very vague notion, mumbling something really, really incoherent about James Baldwin. And wondering, I think what I said to him in the conversation is, why didn't anybody, write like that today? I just finished reading the book and I was just totally blown away. And he said, yeah, nobody does, but maybe you could. Maybe you could, maybe you could at least try. So try I did over several drafts. And I was just asking Chris, how much, heartburn I gave him as I was turning in those drafts, because they did not look like what the finished book is. Without him, without Chris's guidance, without Chris's mentorship, I would not be here right now. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank Greg Kuby, who's in the back next to Chris, who's somehow worked some magic to get us books here tonight, which we're very happy to have, and it's been, I guess we're on daily emails right now. Greg has, basically controlled the flow of publicity, which is unlike anything that I've ever imagined. I mean, I just did not see this happening, going from a notion to, all the publicity that we've had for the book. As I said, this book proceeded from a notion, and there are a couple of main notions that are really at work here. And one of the dominant ideas in the book Between the World and Me, which is effectively an extended essay, told in a letter form to my son, is the notion of fear. Because I think when people think about African American communities, there are a lot of things that come to mind, but one of the things that does not come to mind, I think, enough in the mainstream conversation is simply how afraid we are for our bodies, how afraid we are for our children, how afraid we are for our loved ones on a daily basis. And I understood this as a very, very young person as I talk about it in the book. From my earliest memories, I was talking to Dad about this a little while ago, and I think about my first memories my first coherent memories of going with my mother and father to see Marshal Eddie Conway in prison. And understanding that black men, are in prison. That was like my first memory, that he had done something or somebody accused him of something, or something had happened where he did not have the full freedom and control of his body. And that was something that happened to people who looked like me, even if I didn't quite understand how and why that happened. And then as you grow up in the community and you have to, go out into the world and, navigate, I've said this several times in many places, I have, my memories of going to middle school here in Baltimore, and I think about how much of my mental space was possessed with keeping my body safe. How much of it dealt with how I was dressed, who I was walking with, what neighborhood I was walking through once I got to school, how I conducted myself, in the school, and not so much, in such a way that would be obedient to my teachers, but in a way that would keep me safe from the amount of violence. I was talking in this interview the other day, I was saying that any sort of policy that you think about in this country that has to do with race ultimately comes back for black folks to securing our bodies, the physical safety of our bodies. So we have these kind of high and abstract debates about, affirmative action. And in the minds of certain people, we think those conversations are literally, just about, is my kid going to get into Harvard or not? But behind that, for us as black people, is a conversation of, is my kid gonna be able to have the means to live in a neighborhood where he or she walks outside the house and they're not looking over their shoulder, and they're not watching their back, and they don't have to do the sort of things that I have to do. The threat of violence is always there. Now, one of the horrifying things, and this is what, I'm going to read about tonight, even for those of us who escape those neighborhoods, even for those of us who make it somewhere and are able to do, something and live in better places, the threat never quite leaves us. Because once we're no longer afraid of the neighborhood, it turns out we actually have to have some fear for the very people we pay taxes to protect us. And that's what we've been hearing about for the past year over this country. We've been seeing a lot of that. And it seems like there's a kind of national conversation going on right now about those who are paid to protect us, who sometimes end up inflicting lethal harm upon us. But for me, this conversation is old, and I'm sure for many of you, the conversation is quite old. It's the cameras that are new. It's not the violence that's new. We are not in the midst of a new wave of anything. We're in a new technological wave. And this is not unprecedented. The sort of violence that folks saw, in the 1960s, in Selma, for instance, or on Bloody Sunday, that sort of violence was not, in fact, actually new. That's what white supremacy, what racism is. It is an act of violence. What was new was the cameras. There was certain technology that was able to take that into the living rooms of America, and we're going through a similar thing right now. But the violence is not new. When I think about the first time I really became aware of this, beyond theory. It was in the instance of the killing of a good friend of mine, I should say, to clarify our relationship, a friend of mine by the name of Prince Jones, who I went to Howard University with. As a brief aside, when you write things, they're forced to become abstract, or when you interview people, they become abstract, and then whenever you're forced to talk about them, they immediately become real, and all the emotions that you feel about those people come back. I'm going to try to control myself here. Prince Jones was a fellow student of mine at Howard University. He was a tall, beautiful young man. He hailed from a prosperous family, a family that had not always been prosperous. His mother, was the child of sharecroppers, had worked her, way up through life out of, poverty in Louisiana, and had risen to become a prominent radiologist. Prince was in Prince George's County, Maryland, driving. It was late at night. He had just dropped off his young daughter. He was going to see his fiance, and he was in a Jeep, an SUV. The SUV he was in was being followed, as it turned out, by the police, the Prince George's County Police. And I'm in Baltimore, so you guys know about the reputation of the Prince George's County Police. I don't need to give any sort of lectures on that. The gentleman who was following him had come to work that night as an undercover police officer and had dressed up as a drug dealer. So he was, literally dressed as a criminal, to appear as a criminal. He was in an unmarked car. He thought Prince Jones was someone else who he was supposed to be doing surveillance on. He tracked Prince Jones from Prince George's County, Maryland, through Washington, D.C., and into Fairfax, Virginia, where, as far as I'm concerned, he effectively executed him. And the story he tells, because he's the only witness, and he's the only person whose version of events we actually have, the story he tells is that once they got to Fairfax, they got into a dark cul-de-sac, and Prince rammed his car. And he said before Prince rammed his car, he got out of the car, and he pulled the gun on Prince, and he identified himself as a police officer, but he didn't produce his badge. By his own admission, he didn't produce his badge. By his testimony, Prince got back in the car, and into his truck, and rammed the police officer's car, and the police officer shot and killed him. This happened in 2000. I believe my son was about a month old at that point. And you talk about fears for like bringing a black child into the world, like it was immediately real. It was just suddenly so visceral, like right there. And the most terrifying thing for me was when I thought about myself, I couldn't distance myself from what Prince had done, even in the version of events as given by the officer, whether they're true or not. Even in the most sympathetic version of events given by the officer, I could not distance myself from whatever actions Prince Jones had taken in that case. I had to imagine myself followed through 3 jurisdictions by somebody who did not identify himself as a police officer, who was literally dressed to appear as a criminal. And I had to think about all the fears that I had to have as I was going through the neighborhood here in Baltimore, and all the fears that Prince must have had. Going to visit my fiance and worrying about her, and seeing this dude pull a gun out on me and claim to be a police. Well, I don't know if you're a police officer. And once I got into his shoes, it was very, very easy for me to see myself how I could have been killed in much the same way. And this was horrifying. And so for normal Americans, once they, rise up, and get out of, certain neighborhoods or go certain places, they feel a kind of safety that black people never feel. Fear is one of the dominant emotions of the black experience. Fear. And it does no amount of money you can earn can ever take you away from that. You can be president of the United States. And you can be afraid for your body. You can be the first lady of the United States. And you can be afraid for your body. You can be afraid for the bodies of your 2 little girls. It does not go away. There's no escape from that. Well, Prince's story stayed with me for a number of years. And I wrote about it in little, places, but I couldn't get his mom out of my head. I kept wondering, because I knew this woman had done all this, and I couldn't get her out of my head, and I wondered how she lived. I wondered how she carried that. And I reached out and I made contact with her, and I was able to go see her. And so the portion of the book I'm going to read tonight tells the story of our conversation. As I said, Between the World and Me is written as a letter to my son, so all of the yous and all of the sort of, things, it's me addressing him, who is not here right now, somewhere in the middle of Vermont right now. The story, goes a lot of places. It, goes to Howard University, goes to Paris, France. It moves quite a bit, but at this point, we're at the end and we're trying to, get some sort of resolution and some sort of conclusion on everything we've seen. So I'll go ahead and read. In the years after Prince Jones died, I thought often of those who were left to make their lives in the shadow of his death. I thought of his fiancée and wondered what it meant to see the future upended with no explanation. I wondered what she would tell his daughter, and I wondered how his daughter would imagine her father, when she would miss him, how she would detail the loss. But mostly I wondered about Prince's mother, and the question I mostly asked myself was always the same: how did she live? I searched for her phone number online. I emailed her. She responded. Then I called and made an appointment to visit. And living she was just outside of Philadelphia in a small gated community of affluent homes. It was a rainy Tuesday when I arrived. I had taken the train in from New York and then picked up a rental car. I was thinking of Prince a lot in those months before. You, your mother, and I had gone to homecoming at the Mecca, and so many of my friends were there, and Prince was not. Dr. Jones greeted me at the door. She was lovely, polite, brown. She appeared to be somewhere in that range between 40 and 70 years when it is difficult to precisely ascertain a black person's precise age. She was, whenever I read that in front of white people, nobody laughs. She was well composed, given the subject of our conversation, and for most of the visit, I struggled to separate how she actually felt from what I felt she must be feeling. What I felt right then was that she was smiling through pained eyes, that the reason for my visit spread sadness like a dark quilt over the whole house. I seemed to recall music, jazz or gospel playing in the back. But conflicting with that, I also remember a deep quiet overcoming everything. I thought that perhaps she had been crying. I could not tell for sure. She led me into her large living room. There was no one else in the house. It was early January. Her Christmas tree was still standing at the end of the room, and there were stockings bearing the name of her daughter and her lost son, and there was a framed picture of him, Prince Jones, on a display table. She brought me water in a heavy glass. She drank tea. She told me that she was born and raised outside Opelousas, Louisiana, that her ancestors had been enslaved in that very same region, and that as a consequence of that enslavement, a great fear echoed down through the ages. It first became clear to me when I was 4, she told me. My mother and I were going into the city. We got on the Greyhound bus. I was behind my mother. She wasn't holding my hand at the time, and I plopped down in the first seat I found. A few minutes later, my mother was looking for me, and she took me to the back of the bus and explained why I couldn't sit there. We were very poor, and most of the black people around us who I knew were poor also, and the images I had of white America were from going into the city and seeing who was behind the counter in the stores and seeing who my mother worked for. It became clear that there was a distance. This chasm makes itself known to us in all kinds of ways. A little girl wanders home at age 7 after being teased in school and asks her parents, "Are we niggers, and what does this mean?" Sometimes it is subtle, the simple observation of who lives where and works what jobs and who does not. Sometimes it is all at once. I have never asked you how you became personally aware of the distance. Was it Michael Brown? I don't think I want to know. But I know that it has happened to you already, that you have deduced that you are privileged and yet still different from other privileged children because you are the bearer of a body more fragile than any other in this country. What I want you to know is that it is not your fault, even if it is ultimately your responsibility. It is your responsibility because you are surrounded by the dreamers. It has nothing to do with how you wear your pants or how you style your hair. The breach is as intentional as policy, as intentional as the forgetting that follows. The breach allows from the efficient sorting of the plundered from the plunderers, the enslaved from the enslavers, sharecroppers from landholders, cannibals from food. Dr. Jones was reserved. She was what people once referred to as a lady, and in that sense reminded me of my grandmother, who was a single mother in the projects but always spoke as though she had nice things. And when Dr. Jones described her motive for escaping the dearth that marked the sharecropper life of her father and all the others around her, when she remembered herself saying, "I'm not going to live like this," I saw the iron in her eyes, and I remembered the iron in my grandmother's eyes. You must barely remember her by now. You were 6 when she died. I remember her, of course, but by the time I knew her exploits, how, for instance, she scrubbed white people's floors during the day and went to school at night, were legend. But I still could feel the power and the rectitude that propelled her out of the projects and into home ownership. It was the same power I felt in the presence of Dr. Jones. When she was in 2nd grade, she and another child made a pact that they would both become doctors, and she held up her end of the bargain. But first, she integrated the high school in her town. At the beginning, she fought the white children who insulted her. At the end, they voted her class president. She ran track. It was a great entree, she told me, but it only brought her so far into that world. At football games, the other students would cheer the star black running back. And then when a black player on the other team got the ball, they'd yell, "Kill that nigga, kill that nigga." They would yell this sitting right next to her, as though she really were not there. She gave Bible recitations as a child, and she told me the story of her recruitment into the business. Her mother took her to audition for the junior choir. Afterward, the choir director said, "Honey, I think you should talk." She was laughing lightly now, not uproariously, still in control of her body. I felt that she was warming up. As she talked of the church, I thought of your grandfather, the one you know, and how his first intellectual adventures were found in the recitation of Bible passages. I thought of your mother who did the same, and I thought of my own distance from an institution that has so often been the only support for our people. I often wonder if in that distance I've missed something, some notion of cosmic hope, some wisdom beyond my mean physical perceptions of the world, something beyond the body that I might have transmitted to you. I wondered this at that particular moment because something beyond anything I have ever understood drove Mabel Jones to an exceptional life. She went to college on full scholarship. She went to med school at Louisiana State University. She served in the Navy. She took up radiology. She did not know any other black radiologists. I assumed that this would have been hard on her, but she was insulted by the assumption. She could not acknowledge any discomfort, and she did not speak of herself as remarkable because it conceded too much, because it sanctified tribal expectation when the only expectation that mattered should be rooted in an assessment of Mabel Jones. And by those lights, there was nothing surprising in her success because Mabel Jones was always pedal to the floor, not over or around, but through. And if she was going to do it, it must be done to death. Her disposition toward life was that of an elite athlete who knows the opponent is dirty and the refs are on the take, but also knows that the championship is one game away. She called her son, Prince Jones, Rocky, in honor of her grandfather who went by Rock. I asked about his childhood because the facts that I had not known Prince all that well. He was among the people I would be happy to see at a party, whom I would describe as a friend, as a good brother, though I could not really account for his comings and goings. So she sketched him for me so that I might better understand. She said that he once hammered a nail into an electrical socket and shorted out the entire house. She said that he once dressed himself in a suit and tie and got down on one knee and sang 3 times a lady. She said that he'd gone to private school his entire life, schools filled with dreamers, but he made friends wherever he went, in Louisiana and later in Texas. I asked her how his friends' parents treated her. By then I was the chief of radiology at the local hospital, she said, and so they treated me with respect. She said this with no love in her eye, coldly, as though she were explaining a mathematical function. Like his mother, Prince was smart. In high school, he was admitted to a Texas magnet school for math and science, where students acquire college credit. Despite the school drawing from a state with roughly the population of Angola, Australia, or Afghanistan, Prince was the only black child. I asked Dr. Jones if she had wanted him to go to Howard. She smiled and said, no. And then she added, it's so nice to be able to talk about this. This relaxed me a little because I could think of myself as something more than an intrusion. I asked where she had wanted him to go for college. She said, Harvard, and if not Harvard, Princeton, and if not Princeton, Yale, and if not Yale, Columbia, and if not Columbia, Stanford. He was that caliber of student. But like at least 1/3 of all the students who I knew who came to Howard, Prince was tired of having to represent to other people. These Howard students were not like me. They were the children of the Jackie Robinson elite, whose parents rose up out of the ghettos and the sharecropping fields, went out into the suburbs, only to find that they carried the mark with them, and they could not escape. Even when they succeeded, as so many of them did, they were singled out, made examples of, transfigured into parables of diversity. They were symbols and markers, never children or young adults. And so they came to Howard to be normal, and even more to see how broad the black normal really is. Prince did not apply to Harvard, nor Princeton, nor Yale, nor Columbia, nor Stanford. He only wanted the Mecca. I asked Dr. Jones if she regretted Prince choosing Howard. She gasped. It was as though I had pushed too hard on a bruise. No, she said, I regret that he's dead. She said this with great composure and greater pain. She said this with all the odd poise and direction that the great American injury demands of you. Have you ever taken a hard look at those pictures from the sit-ins in the 60s, a hard, serious look? Have you ever looked at the faces? The faces are neither angry, nor sad, nor joyous. They betray almost no emotion. They look out past their tormentors, past us, and focus on something way beyond anything ever known to me. I think they are fastened to their God, a God whom I cannot know. But God or not, the armor is all over them, and it is real. Or perhaps it is not armor at all. Perhaps it is life extension, a kind of loan allowing you to take the assaults heaped upon you now and pay down the debts later. Whatever it is, that same look I see in those pictures, noble and vacuous, that was the look I saw in Mabel Jones. It was in her sharp brown eyes, which welled but did not break. She held so much under her control, and I was sure the days since her Rocky was plundered, since her lineage was robbed, had demanded nothing less. And she could not lean on her country for help. When it came to her son, Dr. Jones's country did what it does. It forgot him. The forgetting is habit. It is yet another necessary component of the dream. They have forgotten the scale of theft that enriched them in slavery, the terror that allowed them for a century to pilfer the vote, the segregationist policy that gave them their suburbs. They have forgotten because to remember would tumble them out of the beautiful dream and force them to live down here with us, down here in the world. I am convinced that the dreamers, at least the dreamers of today, would rather live white than live free. In the dream, they are Buck Rogers, Prince Aragorn, an entire race of Skywalkers. To awaken them is to reveal that they are an empire of humans, and like all empires of humans, are built on the destruction of the body. It is to sustain their nobility, to make them vulnerable, fallible, breakable humans. Dr. Jones was asleep when the phone rang. It was 5 a.m., and on the phone was a detective telling her she should drive to Washington. Rocky was in the hospital. Rocky had been shot. She drove with her daughter. She was sure he was still alive. She paused several times as she explained this to me. She went directly to the ICU. Rocky was not there. A group of men with authority, doctors, lawyers, detectives perhaps, took her into a room and told her he was gone. She paused again. She did not cry. Composure was too important now. It was unlike anything I had felt before, she told me. It was extremely physically painful. So much so that whenever a thought of him would come to mind, all I could do was pray and ask for mercy. I thought I was going to lose my mind and go crazy. I felt sick. I felt like I was dying. I asked if she expected that the police officer who had shot Prince would be charged. She said, yes. Her voice was a cocktail of emotions. She spoke like an American with the same expectations of fairness, even fairness belated and begrudged, that she took into medical school all those years ago, and she spoke like a black woman with all the pain that undercuts those exact feelings. I now wondered about her daughter, who'd been recently married. There was a picture on display of this daughter and her new husband. Dr. Jones was not optimistic. She was intensely worried about her daughter bringing a son into America because she could not save him. She could not secure his body from the ritual violence that claimed her son. She compared America to Rome. She said she thought the glory days of this country had long ago passed, and even those glory days were sullied because they had been built on the bodies of others. And we can't get the message, she said. We don't understand that we are embracing our deaths. I asked Dr. Jones if her mother was still alive. She told me her mother passed away in 2002 at the age of 89. I asked Dr. Jones how her mother had taken Prince's death, and her voice retreated into an almost whisper, and Dr. Jones said, I don't know that she did. She alluded to 12 years a slave. There he was, she said, speaking of Solomon Northup. He had means. He had a family. He was living like a human being, and one racist act took him back. And the same is true of me. I spent years developing a career, acquiring assets, engaging responsibilities, and one racist act. It's all it takes. And then she talked again of all that she had, through great industry, through unceasing labor, acquired in the long journey from grinding poverty. She spoke of how her children had been raised in the lap of luxury, annual ski trips, jaunts off to Europe. She said that when her daughter was studying Shakespeare in high school, She took her daughter to England, and when her daughter got her license at 16, a Mazda 626 was waiting out front. I sensed some connection to this, some desire to give, and the raw poverty of her youth. I sensed that it was all as much for her as it was for her children. She said that Prince had never taken to material things. He loved to read. He loved to travel. But when he turned 23, she bought him a Jeep. She had a huge purple bow put on it. She told me that she still could see him there, looking at the Jeep and simply saying, "Thank you." Without interruption, she added, "And that was the Jeep he was killed in." After I left, I sat in the car for a few minutes. I thought of all that Prince's mother had invested in him and all that was lost. I thought of the loneliness that sent him to the Mecca and how we could not save him, how we ultimately cannot save ourselves. I thought back on the sit-ins, the protesters with their stoic faces, the ones I'd once scorned for hurling their bodies at the worst things in life. Perhaps they had known something terrible about the world. Perhaps they so willingly parted with the security and sanctity of the black body because neither security nor sanctity existed in the first place. And all those old photographs from the 1960s, all those films I beheld of black people prostrate before clubs and dogs were not shameful. Indeed, were not shameful at all. They were just true. We are captured, brother, surrounded by the majoritarian bandits of America. And this has happened here in our only home. And the terrible truth is that we cannot will ourselves to an escape on our own. Perhaps that is the hope of the movement, to awaken the dreamers, to rouse them to the facts of what their need to be white, to talk like they are white, to think that they are white, which is to think that they are beyond the design flaws of humanity, has done to the world. You, Samari, you cannot arrange your life around them and the small chance of them coming into consciousness. Our moment is too brief. Our bodies are too precious. And you are here now and you must live. And there is so much out there to live for, not just in someone else's country, but in your own home. The warmth of dark energies that drew me to the Mecca, that drew out Prince Jones, the warmth of our particular world is beautiful, no matter how brief and breakable. I think back to our trip to homecoming. I think back to the warm blast rolling over us. We were at the football game. We were sitting in the bleachers with old friends and their children, caring for neither fumbles nor first downs. I remember looking toward the goalpost and watching a pack of alumni cheerleaders so enamored with Howard University that they donned their old colors and took out their old uniforms just a little bit so they'd fit. I remember them dancing. They'd shake, freeze, shake again, and when the crowd yelled, "Do it, do it, do it," a black woman 2 rows in front of me in her tightest jeans stood and shook as though she was not somebody's mama, and the past 20 years had barely been a week. I remember walking down to the tailgate party without you. I could not bring you, but I have no problem telling you what I saw. The entire diaspora around me, hustlers, lawyers, cappers, busters, doctors, barbers, deltas, drunkards, geeks, and nerds. The DJ hollered into the mic. The young folks pushed toward him. A young man pulled out a bottle of cognac and twisted the cap. A girl with him smiled, tilted her head back, imbibed, laughed, and I felt myself disappearing into all of their bodies. The birthmark of damnation faded, and I could feel the weight of my arms, and I could feel the heave in my breath, and I was not talking then because there was no point. That was a moment, a joyous moment beyond their dream, a moment imbued by a power more gorgeous than any voting rights bill. This power, this black power, originates in a view of the American galaxy taken from a dark and essential planet. Black power is the dungeon side view of Monticello, which is to say, the view taken in struggle. And black power bursts a kind of understanding that illuminates all the galaxies in their truest colors. Even the dreamers, lost in their great revelry, feel it. For it is Billy that they reach for in sadness, and Mobb Deep is what they holler in boldness. and Isley is what they hum in love, and Dre is what they yell in revelry, and Aretha is the last sound they hear before dying. We have made something down here. We have taken the one-drop rule of dreamers and flipped them. They made us into a race, but we made ourselves into a people. Here at the Mecca, under the pain of selection, we have made a home, as do black people on summer blocks marked with needles, vials, and hopscotch squares, as do black people dancing it out at rent parties, as do black people at their family reunions where we are regarded like the survivors of catastrophe, as do black people toasting their cognac and German beers, passing their blunts and debating MCs, as do all of us who have voyaged through death to life upon these shores. That was the love power that drew Prince Jones. The power is not just divinity, but a deep knowledge of how fragile everything, even the dream, especially the dream, really is. Sitting in that car, I thought of Dr. Jones's predictions of national doom. I had heard such predictions all my life from Malcolm and all of his posthumous followers, who hollered that the dreamers must reap what they sow. I saw the same prediction in the words of Marcus Garvey, who promised to return in a whirlwind of vengeful ancestors, an army of Middle Passage undead. No. When I left the Mecca, I knew that that was all too pat, and knowing that the dreamers should reap what they had sown, we would reap it right along with them. Plunder has matured into habit, and habit into addiction, and the people who could author the mechanized death of our ghettos, the mass rape of private prisons, and then engineer their own forgetting, must inevitably plunder much more. This is not a belief in prophecy. It is a belief in the seductiveness of cheap gasoline. Once the dream's parameters were caged by technology and by the limits of horsepower and wind, but the dreamers have improved themselves, and the damming of seas for voltage, the extraction of coal, the transmuting of oil into food have enabled an expansion, a plunder with no known precedent. And this revolution has freed the dreamers to plunder not just the body of black humans, but the body of the earth itself. The earth is not our creation. It has no respect for us. It has no use for us. And its vengeance is not the fire in the cities, but the fire in the sky. Something more fierce than Marcus Garvey is riding on the whirlwind. Something more awful than all of our African ancestors is rising with the seas. The two phenomena are unknown to each other. It was the cotton that passed through our chained hands that inaugurated this age. It is the flight from us that sent them sprawling into their subdivided woods, and the method of transport through these new subdivisions across the sprawl is the automobile, the noose around the neck of the earth, and ultimately the dreamers themselves. I drove away from the house of Mabel Jones thinking of all of this. I drove away, as always, thinking of you. I do not believe we can stop them, Samari, because they must ultimately stop themselves. And still I urge you to struggle. Struggle for the memory of your ancestors. Struggle for wisdom. Struggle for the warmth of the Mecca. Struggle for your grandmother and grandfather. Struggle for your name. But do not struggle for the dreamers. Hope for them. Pray for them if you are so moved. But do not pin your struggle on their conversion. The dreamers will have to learn to struggle themselves, to understand that the field for their dream, the stage where they have painted themselves white, is the deathbed of us all. The dream is the same habit that endangers the planet, the same habit that sees our bodies stowed away in prisons and ghettos. I saw these ghettos driving from Dr. Jones's home. They were the same ghettos I had seen in Chicago all those years ago. The same ghettos where my mother was raised, where my father was raised. Through the windshield, I saw the mark of these ghettos, the abundance of beauty shops, churches, liquor stores, and crumbling housing, and I felt the old fear. Through the windshield, I saw the rain coming down in sheets. Thank you. Well, here's the thing to understand. when I talk about in the book is how Prince was killed and how no one paid attention. It was a smattering of media and it was like it never happened. I don't want to speak for her, but I can say in the conversations we have, she's been immensely thrilled. Because I really, really make a point in any sort of media, like in addition to just writing the book and telling his story and telling her story, I always mention his name, when I'm out doing media. And so she just sent me a note today and said she had heard me on Fresh Air and, seen some other media stuff and was, she just said that, I honored him. I honored him. And I have to tell you, getting a blurb from Toni Morrison is great. It's so awesome, but that's the only blurb that matters. That really is the one that matters. Well, the letter is really the distillation of things that we've been talking about for years. So Samari read this in several forms when it was being written. It was not very new to him. In that sense, the book is kind of artificial. What I will tell you is, from the moment he was born, I really endeavored to not talk to him as though he were, I don't want to say a child, but as though he was stupid. I have never tried to hide things from him. I've always been very, very clear with him about, where he lives and, what that means for his body, what that means for his safety, and any question that he's ever asked me about living in this country, especially as it regards to racism and white supremacy in this country. I've been very, very direct about answering him. And so in writing this book, I wanted to write in the same sort of candid, in very, very direct manner. This is not particularly shocking. Nothing in this book is going to be shocking to somebody. I think it's going to be a lot more shocking for other people. Well, I didn't think too much about giving a message to America when I wrote this book. What I really wanted to do was harness, so much of what I saw in the community, and America could take from that what it wanted. But the first thing, and that's I'm kind of being flip, but that's actually really, really important. You know what I mean? Because I think what happens in art, what happens in books, what happens in movies, what happens in good TV shows is you say to people, yeah, I see your pain, I see your fears, I see your anger. You're not crazy. This is real. This is actually a real thing. And so, I have to tell, obviously I hope everybody reads the book, but I wrote it, thinking about a black audience, very, very much. I can't, I'm not in control of what the broader country takes from that, and I probably would not, I think like one can drive oneself crazy, even thinking about what we want folks to take from it, because people, you have no control over that. You have no control over whether people are going to hear you or not, and so one of the things, I felt I was in control of was if I wrote the story well, folks who had my experience, folks who had, grown up like me, would see it and say, so what I was feeling, I wasn't crazy. I know when I tell this story at work, people look at me like I'm crazy, but I know I'm not. That was like, like what I tell people is like there's racism, right? And then there's the mind trick that people play on you by telling you it ain't real. And it's very, very important to, you can't really control what other people see, but it's very, very important to, be able to look at folks and say, listen, I know, and I know that you know, whether you want to say that or not, I know, so that was like a big part of the book for me. Right, so just, I'm imagining most folks here know who Kalief Browder is, but just to, expound, Kalief Browder, I was just talking about him upstairs. Kalief Browder was a young man in New York City who was suspected, falsely as it turns out, of stealing somebody's backpack. And you use the word kidnap because that's exactly what happened. Effectively, that is what happened. He was taken off of the streets, arrested is the term that, we would use when we talk about the state. He was taken to Rikers Island. He was held for bail for $3,000 before trial, no trial, $3,000. His family was poor, they could not pay the money. Kalief Browder was held for 3 years in jail with no trial. Kidnapping is the right word because it's either you pay this money or, you stay in jail. And what happened while he was in jail, as far as I am concerned, is he was subject to systemic torture. I don't know how else to put it. He was beaten by other prisoners. Guards prevented it. He was beaten by guards. This is not rumor. They have it on video, literally the guards, beating the hell out of him. He was sent to solitary confinement for a third of the time of those 3 years, which is in fact mental torture as far as I'm concerned. And to top this all off, Kalief Browder was 16 years old when he was picked up. He was not an adult. He was a juvenile. He was a juvenile. So I don't know how to describe this except with the words you use, kidnapping, and extortion. Either you pay this money or I do this to you. There's a law in New York that, ostensibly says you're only supposed to be held for 6 months, but, prosecutors manipulated that law and over again. And he was held. By the time he got out, he, was suffering from severe mental illness, and ended up hanging himself, and he's dead now. And that, the family is suing the city. And the city will, I guess, pay some sort of civil settlement. But see, they can't make that good. They can't. There's no amount of money that can bring that boy back. There's nothing that can make that right. And so you asked me how it influenced. I did know about Kalief Browder when I was writing this book because there had been a story written about him in the New Yorker that I had read. And for me, I hate to say this, but it wouldn't. It didn't. Even if I hadn't known, it wouldn't have changed the book one bit. Because the exact sort of way that they dealt with Kalief Browder's body was exactly how they dealt with Prince Jones's body. It's exactly how they dealt with Tamir Rice's body. It's exactly how they dealt with Freddie Gray's body, which is to say, worthless. And there's no difference. Your body has no worth at all, except as a piece of meat for me to vend to somebody else, So that's it. One of the things I wanted to do in this book was, make people understand that racism and white supremacy are active things. They are not, there is nothing natural, nothing in this world natural about me looking at you and saying, because you have, blonde hair, in the case of me being black, you have blonde hair, you have blue eyes, you have green eyes, you are descended, from, England or German stock or whatever, I should enslave you and make money off of you. There's nothing natural, about that. And we know this because, the fact of the matter is that, people who are, trace their ancestry back, to Africa, people who trace their, the dominant strain of their ancestry back to Europe, these groups of people have been in contact with each other for a long time. And then something changed. And one of the things that changed was that this, new strip of land was found by a group of people, and there was labor needed to work it. And to efficiently, work that labor, to get as much out of the land as possible, it was necessary to brutalize people. It was found to be necessary. We thought it was necessary to brutalize people. The way I justify your brutalization is by describing you as of a different stock. We know that, even being black, you know what I mean? And I'm, very proud of being black and happy to be black and glad to be black. There's just no consistent definition of it across time. So I'm here right now, in West Baltimore, and I'm black, right? If I were in Louisiana 200 years ago, I might be described as something else. If I were in Brazil somewhere, I might be described as something else. There are people who, for all intents and purposes in other places of the world, look white who are very much black. First African-American president of Howard University, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, you should pull up a picture of him. You would not, maybe some of you would know. Maybe some of you would know after I told you. But, I don't necessarily believe that folks would know right off the bat, right? So the notion that there are, the dominant notion is that there are these different races. There's a group of people, a strain of people descended from Africa, a strain of people descended from Europe, a strain of people descended from Asia, a strain of people who were here in the Americas. They come into conflict, thus we get racism. But see, that ignores the man-made aspect of it. It ignores the fact that people actually had to do something. That this was not, gifted to us by God or nature or whatever. That we needed something. And we wanted to do something to somebody. And in order to justify morally doing that, we put people in another box. And again, we know this because you can literally see it evolving across American history. You can see the notion of race evolving from the time that first group of Africans get here in 1619, changing how people talk about things. We know it very well. It's very, very disturbing when you think about it too, because one of the things that people say in order to comfort themselves is, well, in 2050 we're going to be a majority the dominant, majority in this country is going to be people of color. But white people have moved the boundary before, right? you act like it's been consistent, and people don't realize that. There was a time when Irish people were not considered white, Italians people here were not considered white, Jewish people were not considered. The lines move. As the power needs the lines, there's nothing natural about this. There's no natural line that says Hispanic or Latino. You know what I mean? There's no natural line that says black. Now within that, especially for black folks as compared to white folks, there are all sorts of traditions and histories, and ideals that are very, very real. Ways of talking, food that we love, traditions that are very, very real. And I think, and this is like one of the subtle messages in this book, see, we are not the photo negative of white people. We are an ethnic group. We have a culture independent of itself that we call black. White is a notion that's totally based on dominance. Now within that there are ethnicities, right? There's a Jewish ethnicity. Some people identify as Southerners. Some people might identify as Californians. All sorts of ways of identifying yourself within that. But the notion of being white, as it's understood, cannot be divorced from dominating people. That's a huge, huge problem. It's actually, and so when you talk about moving forward, the reason why, throughout the book, I say, think they are white, which is, a derivation I pulled from Baldwin. Believe they are white. It's a nod to the fact that this is not a real thing. And the only thing that really is holding this is the right to plunder other people. And frankly, to move forward, it requires the elimination of that idea, which is not to say the elimination of people with blue eyes or blonde hair or fairer skin, but the elimination of the idea that those people are white. Well, I think before that, you have to get people to believe that that's necessary. I mean, that really is. I wrote a piece about a year ago, arguing for reparations, and a huge, part of that, people always say to me, well, won't reparations be divisive? I said no, because by the time we got to reparations, that would mean that some critical mass of this country had accepted a totally different version of history and a totally different, politics, and so I think. The big barrier, against that, like you think about, okay, well, yeah, let's normally say that would be a good idea, right? Or how do we get there? I mean, the first thing that has to happen is some critical mass of Americans have to accept that something wrong happened here. I was talking to a friend of mine in New York who's a Japanese American. And she was talking about how she when she went to Yale, she could remember coming down to the cities to see, which effectively was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Japanese Americans in this country who had been interned. Somehow it had gotten, through folks' head that something had happened that was wrong. And a critical mass of Americans had accepted that. We're different. And this is like the tough thing for us. We are not just different, because we're dark or anything like that. We are different because the plunder and attempted destruction of black people in this country, the plunder of black bodies, it is foundational. It indicts everything that this country thinks about itself. How can you go to war in other places and preach about democracy once you have a firm understanding of what actually happened here? Once you really understand what your democracy was built on. There's no separating American. And I say this all the time. People talk about, democracy in this country, and they conceive of enslavement. They conceive of Jim Crow. They conceive of all these horrible things that happened to black people as things that were like a bump on the road to this greater good. But that was how the greater good happened. That was how they did it. Without the, the wealth of enslavement, without having this social class, as I talk about in the book, that was the permanent below. Without being able to live in South Carolina and know just by the fact of being white, no matter how, poor you were, somehow you were a noble, somehow you were an aristocrat, somehow you were better than half the people who lived there. Without that, you can't really speak of an America. And so the question is, how much can we take? I mean, that really is. And, the other piece of that is it's not like the Native Americans, right, where their population was reduced. And so now people can talk about, oh, it's so horrible what we did. Well, they don't have the political power that black people have. I mean, black people are, a relatively dangerous element in this country. And so getting that to happen, I don't have answers for that. I don't have, but the hope, if there is any, is that, some critical mass in this country will begin to accept what actually happened here. Without that, we're in deep trouble. No, because and I said this, in the reading, a big part of this is the fact of, folks doing what they're going to do does not relieve you of the responsibility to struggle. And no matter what comes out of struggle, win or lose, struggle is noble. Struggle is noble. And this is like so key and so important. Okay, there was 250 years of enslavement in this country. Very few African Americans who were enslaved in this country lived to see the end of enslavement. People struggled nonetheless. I think about Ida B. Wells. I always use this example. Ida B. Wells dedicated her life, to fighting against the great crime of lynching, of white racist terrorism. And one of the great goals of her life was to get an anti-lynching bill passed in the Senate. When Ida B. Wells died, there was no anti-lynching bill. They didn't even apologize. The Senate apologized for lynching in 2004, 60, 70 years after Ida B. Wells had died. She never got to see success. I strongly suspect, in fact, I know that for people who are struggling for broad social change, failure is the norm. Failure in your lifetime is the norm. There's no, sort of assurance that in your lifetime, struggle will be successful. But in the same way that those enslaved black people were able to struggle, on behalf of generations beyond them, beyond their natural lifetime. It is natural and it is necessary for you to struggle on behalf of things that you might not see. I wrote the case for reparations. People said, will you expect to see reparations? No, not in my time, not in my son's time, not in my grandchild's time, probably not in my great-great-grandchild's time. Perhaps someday, though. Perhaps someday. And I think you have to approach it that way. Struggle is noble no matter what other folks do. How you conduct yourself is noble no matter what, comes out of that. You hope you win, but you know that most people, in this don't. It's not like, around the Confederate flag, the Confederate flag coming down, a lot of reporting says suddenly the Confederate flag came down. No, Du Bois is writing about this in the 1940s, writing about the Confederate flag. People have been fighting on this for years. I had, folks at the Atlantic showing me stuff that went back into the 19th century with people objecting to the Confederate flag, late 19th century. It didn't suddenly come down. It's been a long fight, long struggle. And that's how things are. It's not like, Frederick Douglass discovered something in, the 1850s when he, stood up and said enslavement was wrong. Well, Negroes knew that for 250 years. You know what I mean? He was within a long tradition. And your responsibility is to play your part within that tradition. And you have no guarantee of seeing the fruits of labor in your time. Indeed, it is selfish for you to say, I will only struggle if I see the fruits of labor in my time. Because we never would have got here if that was the case.
I want to thank you. Let's thank this brother for
Thank you.